Good evening. I'm Judge Stephen Teskey, retired, and welcome back to Justice Redesign. For more than a year, and not here on Justice Redesign, but on my other podcast, that's a YouTube podcast called The Teskey Brief, we've been on a journey, okay? The series on that particular podcast, and by the way, I welcome you to look it up, The Teskey Brief, on YouTube and subscribe, please. Okay. It's a podcast that separates the law and myth. Okay. But anyway, in that particular podcast, the Teskey Brief on YouTube, we called it the bar card in the breakdown of justice. And at first glance, it looked like a series about prosecutors, and then it looked like a series about judges, and then it looked like a series about ethics. But somewhere along the way, I realized it was really about something much simpler, where the lawyers still remember who they're supposed to represent. Today, I like to close that case, but I'm going to close it on Justice Redesign. One of the first things they teach you in law school is that every lawsuit needs two sides, right? There's a plaintiff, and then there's a defendant. Simple, right? One says, "You hurt me." The other says, "No, I didn't." It's a system that has worked surprisingly well for several hundred years. So imagine my excitement when I discovered America has apparently invented an entirely new category of litigation. Yep. Trump versus Trump. I know, right? I checked it twice. Hey, they even cleaned my glasses. Nope. That's really where we are. Now, before anyone accuses me of exaggerating, let me assure you, a federal judge had essentially the same reaction. Because here's what happened. Donald Trump sued the Internal Revenue Service. Nothing unusual there. People sue the government every day. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. Sometimes government lawyers defend the case so aggressively you begin to wonder whether they're personally paying the damages. Perfectly normal, except Donald Trump then became president, which means the person suing the government became the person running the government. Now, stay with me, okay? Because this gets wonderfully ridiculous. The plaintiff is Donald Trump. The defendant is the Internal Revenue Service. Now, who represents the IRS? Well, it's the Department of Justice. Who ultimately oversees the executive branch? Well, that's Donald Trump. The IRS is in the executive branch. So, the plaintiff controls the lawyers defending the defendant, who happens to be, well, himself. Folks, think about it. That's not litigation. That's family counseling with federal funding. It's like playing chess against yourself, then accusing yourself of cheating before settling the dispute with your own checking account. Now, if you're thinking, "Hey, Judge, that sounds constitutionally questionable," well, congratulations, you've just earned 3 hours of constitutional law credit. Because Judge Kathleen Williams asked essentially the same question, only she used more polite judicial language. She wanted to know whether this lawsuit still involved what lawyers call adverse parties. Now, that's a fancy legal phrase, but here's all it means. You can't have a lawsuit if everyone wants the same outcome, right? Courts don't exist to bless agreements people already made. Courts exist to resolve disputes, real disputes, okay? In the Constitution, the phrase and the standard is case and controversy. The courts can only hear cases in which there is a controversy, real disputes between people genuinely pulling in opposite directions, right? Imagine if the Super Bowl featured the Eagles, playing the Eagles, no referee, no opposing team, same coach, same playbook. Then afterwards, the Eagles announce, "We've reached a mutually agreeable settlement. We're declaring ourselves the winner. Folks, that's not football. That's a staff meeting. And that's exactly why Article 3, the one that covers the judiciary of the Constitution, requires what it calls a real case or controversy. Okay, translation. Somebody has to actually disagree, not pretend to disagree, actually disagree. The framers understood something timeless. Power has a funny way of convincing itself it's still being challenged long after the challenge disappeared. James Madison put it more eloquently than I ever could. He warned that no person should be a judge in his own cause. Why? Because human nature doesn't suddenly become objective simply because someone receives a government title, like President of the United States. That's why judges recuse themselves. That's why prosecutors step aside when conflicts arise. That's why lawyers spend years studying professional ethics, because justice doesn't merely have to be fair, it has to be seen as fair. Now, here's where the story takes a turn even Hollywood writers would reject for being a little too unbelievable. Judge Williams begins asking uncomfortable questions. Questions about adverse parties, questions about whether this lawsuit can even continue. And suddenly, guess what? The lawsuit disappears. Voluntarily dismissed. Just gone. Now, if this were a magician's act, I'd applaud. Hey, that's pretty good. Unfortunately, it was federal litigation. Because what happened next is where this story stops being merely strange and begins to become one of the most extraordinary legal episodes I've witnessed in my career. You see, the lawsuit may have disappeared, but the settlement did not. And that settlement, well, that's where this story changes from courtroom comedy to constitutional tragedy. Because as absurd as Trump versus Trump already sounds, we haven't even reached the part where the Department of Justice negotiated with itself to pay itself using your money. And folks, that's where the real story begins. So, this is Act 1. We just concluded it, of this story. We have 4 more to go. Stay with me, because it gets really good. Thank you for listening. Until Act 2, take care and be safe.